I don't care where you fall in the pecking order of NIL money or, collective bargaining, but the reality becomes you still got to play this game on a Saturday, and the Saturday they're still going to kick it off and you're going to play for 60 minutes. And if you can develop culture and team that can work through adversity, then you still have a chance to win the game.
Hey, teammates, welcome to another episode of It's All About the Team, and we are lucky to have one of the greatest team builders in all of major college football with us today. Please welcome Matt Campbell from the Iowa State Cyclones.
I always tell people, as a college football coach, you usually got to be fired to be able to have everything slow down and give you some reality.
If you want to know what the most important thing you can be in life, it's a parent.
I don't want to know how great your X's and O's are. I would like to know who you are as a human and what you stand for as a man and what you stand for in leading people.
No one in Iowa State history has done what your staff has done. You guys won 11 games this year. I don't think Iowa State had won 11 games ever, was it?
Ever. Yeah.
Ever. Yeah.
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 Coach, thanks so much for having me. Just my respect for you and all the impact you've had on me and the teams that I've been able to be a part of. I'm really grateful to be here.
Well, speaking of grateful, you and I are both grateful because we happen to be blessed to be dropped into homes when we were born that were first and foremost about team, about family, about making a difference to others. And I know your dad was an outstanding coach. I remember when he was at Jackson way back in the day. And so to jog your memory, your earliest recollection of why the team is important back home.
Yeah. Well, I always feel like I was so blessed to have two tremendous parents. And you're right. My father was a longtime educator, over 40 years in public education as a teacher and administrator and as an assistant superintendent of schools, and a head football coach for about 20 years at that time at Massillon Jackson High School. And then, a mother that was involved in community service and, was the, director of community, and for the township in Massillon, Ohio. And then, still today is a lead grant writer for Mercy Medical Center down in Canton, Ohio. And so I was always so fortunate to have two parents that believed in education, that believed in accountability and standards. And, my brother is 4 years younger than myself, just lived in a home and grew up in a home where those standards and expectations were a daily part of the process.
I think those of us that had that blessing to have that model, that example every day of our lives, I think a lot of us ended up going into education because we wanted to go do that for a whole bunch of other young people. And I thank my lucky stars every day that, I could have been born anywhere. I could have had any parents, I guess. But, having that type of background and for all of you listening out there that if you want to know what the most important thing you can be in life, it's a parent. It's a good parent, and it's the right model. And not necessarily their friend, but their parent, their model. I don't imagine your dad was like your best friend in terms of hanging out. He probably held you to some high standards.
Oh, he did. My father, I think all my friends used to say, man, it's so strict at the Campbell house. And I always chuckled because there was, he was, by the time I got into middle school, he was an assistant principal and head football coach. And, I got to be in the locker room and be at practice and, just watching the impact that he had on young people. And, I grew to love the game of football, but I was always so impressed with the relationships that he had with his players and, the ability for some of those players to at times come back to our houses. And honestly, one of my great memories is we had a young man named Dirk Blood that my dad coached that I think played for you, Coach, over at Youngstown State, and going to watch him play and go to watch different college games on Saturdays of the young men that he had the opportunity to coach in high school. And I think what you found out real quick is not only the impact he was having at home, but the impact that he was having on a lot of young people at that time, 16 to 18 years old, and the trajectory of their future. It was a great learning lesson for me.
People ask all the time, well, gosh, your dad was a coach and he was gone all the time. And, was that, you know, hard to handle and this and that? I never felt that way simply because, again, I got to hang around and watch him and stuff. But it was so obvious to me, even at a young age, even when I was 7 or 8 years old, it was so obvious to me how he was pouring into them, how he cared about them, and how he was making a difference, and how they appreciated it. And that's huge.
Yeah, it's such a game changer, and the neat thing for me is life got a little bit older, and you got into high school and into early college, and so many of those former players that you ran into, or even just being back home and seeing former players bring their families over to our house. Man, the impact that you saw, that this wasn't just a 4-year process. This was, if done correctly, it was a lifetime process, and that meant a lot to me. And I think not only seeing that from my father, but then played for a tremendous high school football coach, a gentleman by the name of Keith Wakefield, who,
Oh,
one of the winningest Ohio high school coaches, who really just almost probably had an equally profound impact in my life as a human being, as a standard of excellence in demanding the two values of attitude and effort every single day that you walked into his locker room and his facility. It was a really fortunate journey to be able to grow up at that time in Massillon, Ohio.
I remember when Coach Wakefield was at Austintown Fitch,
Hmm.
and he was tough there, and then obviously had a great career at Perry, and then went and coached at Mount for a while, correct?
He did. He
And then
did.
and then went back to Perry. And I remember when they were calling out around to some people, and I think at the time I was president at Youngstown State, and they called and they said, "Well, have you ever worked with Keith Wakefield?" I said, "Oh, I've recruited from his schools. I've known Keith for 30 years. Whatever. Well, we're considering having him come back to Massillon Perry." And they said, "What do you think about that?" I said, "Well, if you're interested in being successful, if you're interested in someone making a difference with your kids, and if you're interested in someone having high demands, then he's the best guy in the world." And heck, he went back there and had another great run.
Two state championship appearances in little
Right?
old Perry Township. Yeah, and those words are right, Coach. I mean, demanding and accountability, and probably one of the greatest team builders that I've ever seen. In Massillon Perry, you never had a whole bunch of Division I football players,
Right.
but you always had a great team, and
Yep.
you always had a group that was playing for whatever your responsibility was. It was for the best interest of the team, and really, really blessed to have that experience as a 16 to 18-year old who needed, man, even though you came from a great family, and you needed somebody to hold you to those standards and that accountability. And honestly, I think even so much of what I do today goes back to my experience at Massillon Perry and playing for Coach Wakefield.
What's interesting, and I'm going to go off target for a second, but one thing that I'm a dinosaur, and I always tell you that. I always give you my disclaimer. I'm a dinosaur. But the coaches I grew up with, and many of the coaches I coached with, uh, were trained as educators. And educators went into that because they wanted to go make a difference in lives, and they knew they weren't going to make a bunch of money, and those kinds of things. They were in it for what they could do for the others. What I worry a little bit about in our current scenario, whether it's in high schools where many of the coaches aren't the teachers in the school, and so they weren't trained in education, in our colleges, in the old days, heck, for me to get the head coaching job at Youngstown State in 1986, I had to have a master's in education. And now, obviously that wouldn't be the case in college football. And so I worry a little bit that our coaches haven't been trained as educators. And then I think if you went on to the next level, the NFL, I'm certain that, and I just worry a little bit about it. Are we moving from education to entertainment a little too much? I don't know. My pet peeve. Any reaction?
Yeah, I think the reaction is it's really a scary time right now. I think one of the great things about football and our sport is that it's really been able to, no matter what the level has, is to teach such unbelievable foundations of character, accountability, selflessness, and this unity that it is bigger than you. And I think what's happened is there's so much financial gain, whether the high school aspect of it, and maybe not as much, but at least in the collegiate world, we've made it such a transactional journey that we've lost the reality that we're dealing with 18-year-old young men, that our real responsibility is to create 22-year-old men that are great fathers, husbands, community servants, get an unbelievable degree and have a chance to impact their communities. And I think, just even from my own piece of it, so grateful to grow up in a family that valued education, having a great high school coach, and then honestly an experience in college where probably was a part of a transactional journey. Went to the University of Pittsburgh my first year out of high school as a scholarship athlete, and really was a part of a very at that time transactional program, and probably one of the great blessings in my life, because I think sometimes we learn so much by an experience that goes wrong, and how do you use that experience later in life. And it was just coming from such a great high school program. I got to a place at a time that it was a very transactional experience, and you could almost feel it within the walls of the program. A lot of turnover, a lot of transaction, and in a program that I actually left after a year. And it wasn't because of playing time, but it was because of culture and people and the value of growing. And, I ended up at Mount Union, where, I ended up playing for another great coach and coaches. But again, it was the experience of this growing from young man to man, and having people that you knew that they cared about who you were and what you were going through, and taking that journey from 18 to 22, and they valued that process. So I feel like it's a really scary time in our world, because I think there's a lot of programs, and you understand it a little bit. There's so much money that's involved with college athletics today, that we've lost our purpose, and honestly this incredible impact value that we have to make a difference in the lives of young people. And still one of the things we really try to hold true here in our own football program.
I think back to my nearly 50 years in higher ed, and you could see that the revenue of the popularity of sport was growing and growing and growing. I feel bad that we didn't figure out a way 40 years ago, when television got deregulated, and all of a sudden you could see the money was going to start pouring in, and the exposure for intercollegiate athletics was going to grow and grow. And we didn't figure out a way to have the right formula of where we could help the participants. And then, unfortunately, we got to a point, 40 years later, where it just became so unfair, both in reality and in optics, that it exploded. And I think back to, gosh, if we would have just, gotten some people in the room and thought through, how can we fairly, tastefully, within the, guise of education, because right now I feel a little bit as if they say, well, coaches can move, why can't a player move? Or coaches can get paid more, why can't a player? And that's true in their professional careers. But the players, in my mind, are in their formative years. Not that they should be treated unfairly, and I think they were for decades, and there was nothing the coaches could do about it. People maybe above that pay grade could have figured that one out, but they're at a different stage. And I just worry that, we've made it about a transactional, I'll use your phrase, which I'm sure makes it harder in that whole concept of team, when all of a sudden people are trying to think about what's in it for them more than anything. And but you and I have talked in the past. If you think building team and building culture was important before, it's even more important today.
Well, you're so right. And I think the ability to create an environment where young people still want to be able to work through adversity and work through hard. I think that's one of the great things about our sport is, I don't care where you fall in the pecking order of NIL money. or, collective bargaining, but the reality becomes you still got to play this game on a Saturday, and the Saturday they're still going to kick it off and you're going to play for 60 minutes. And if you can develop culture and team that can work through adversity, then you still have a chance to win the game. And, I think one of the great joys of why, we've stayed here at Iowa State and we've really believed about being here, because we've been really fortunate to have a president and an athletic director that's given us the ability to create culture and create team. And, we've been really fortunate to have sustainability of staff that I think has had that vision of how do we love, care, serve, empower these young players and create a place where we can be maybe better developers of the student athlete experience than anybody else in college athletics. And, that's got to be the way that we have to be able to form team here. But I think you're so right. That culture piece, retention of the student athlete, having that student athlete feel confident that, tough times will come, adversity will hit. And, we talk a lot here. You're either in adversity, you're getting out of adversity, or it's coming for you. And you're in one of those three phases of it. And the reality of it is it's the people and the culture that's around you that's going to allow you to grow, to better yourself through it. And, I think that's just so critical right now in all these college programs to be able to still gain the transformation that you want to gain out of this critical time in your life.
I think your university is fortunate. You say you're fortunate to have your athletic director and president in a university that will allow you to be the best teacher you can be, the best culture builder you can be. The university, in my mind, is fortunate, because I'm a little bit nervous about what will be the long-range effect of this change in intercollegiate athletics on the universities.
Right.
Right now it's just a little portion of the university, and the impact will be interesting, and none of us have a crystal ball. And let me back up to something, because we could start talking about NIL and portal and all that stuff till the cows came home. So you had the chance to, the visible part of your family at home was dad and coach and administrator and so forth. And you mentioned mom was the kind of the servant with that willingness to just go serve others and maybe not have a title or, paycheck of great size or whatever. I know you met Erica in 6th grade, right?
I did. Yes.
And I know you couldn't be building the team atmosphere that you build at Iowa State without, that selfless person at home. And so talk to our viewers a little bit about the less obvious things like supportive spouses and people around us that make a difference in building a team.
Yeah, and I would say, I think for me, twofold. Before I get to Erica, because I think there's a group of people in my life that made. I think there's always people that just are there. Everybody says, "Who's your hero?" And for me, my dad's parents, my grandparents, we were so much with them, and I had a grandmother and grandfather that we were impacted so greatly by. I had a grandfather that worked 30 years, 2 jobs. He worked at Ford Motor Company up in Manaway, Ohio, and he worked the midnight shift. And he would come home. He would rinse off about 6 o'clock, got off the shift, and by 8:30, my grandmother had cooked him breakfast, and he was off to the bus garage in Crestwood, and he ran the bus garage for 30 years. And I one of the great lessons that I learned from them, and they were married over 60 years, is the value of family. My grandfather, the value of work ethic. I saw this man work, 2 jobs for 30 years and this incredible work ethic. And yet I watched my grandmother, who, till the day she passed away, she never missed one of my football games. She never missed me playing college football, or even early as when I was the coach at Toledo. And I watched her serve my grandfather, and her faith. She taught us faith, and she taught us servant leadership. And I think for me, then you springboard on to my wife today, and you talk about the other person that's just had this profound impact. One of the probably hardships that you went through a little bit is my parents did go through a tough divorce when I was in high school. And, I think my wife came at a critical time in my life. At 6th grade, we met. We had a great relationship, started dating towards the end of our high school time. And, she came from this big Italian family, and man, they taught you faith, and they taught you loyalty. And, they made such a profound impact on me at such a critical time in my life. And, we've now been together. We'll be married 20 years this year. And, you talk about the experience of building our own family. It's been incredible. We now have 4 great children. My wife went on to get her doctorate degree, and, an audiologist by trade, and, was really working through really the time we came here at Iowa State. And, her work ethic and her impact, not only on my life, but on our children's life, and watching the impact she has during our time here at Iowa State. It's been tremendous. But you need an unbelievable partner. But I learned that from my grandparents, and these 2 amazing people that just taught me so many great values of work ethic and faith and this servant leadership. So really grateful for them, and really grateful to have an unbelievable partner in my wife.
And we always have to remember we're such in the midst of the fray, and when things don't go perfect and the people on the outside, want to comment on that and so forth, usually we're so busy as coaches that we don't even notice it. But our families, really are on the front line. And especially in this day and age of social media. And, I know you have young children, and my kids didn't have to grow up with anyone tweeting about how dumb their dad was, and, all that kind of stuff. And it takes a special team at home in this, very visible world of college athletics.
And it does. And, for me, I always tell this story. COVID hit in 2020, and it was the first time in my career that it ever slowed down for me. I always tell people, as a college football coach, you usually got to be fired to be able to have everything slow down and give you some reality.
Yep.
And, the reality came at that time. I remember COVID hitting, and I became a head coach at a really young age, 31 years old, and probably wasn't ready for it. And, but, it's like you were drinking out of a fire hose until, the world stopped. And when I got home and I saw, holy cow, this is what's going on with these 4 children at home, and man, what it takes to feed them, and what it takes to, everybody's got a million things going on. It gave me some probably much needed reality in my own life. And it's, I think I left there saying, what is important? What is critical to you? And I think the 3 things were, for the first time, is understanding that, man, my family and everything, this job, the impact, what stressors it puts on my wife at home, and really puts on them at home, and the impact of, you don't want to continue to raise everybody else's children and not do a great job of raising our own children at home. I thought that was really critical. And, 2 is, you showed, obviously, as that stress hit during that time, is, man, you want to be around great people. You want to be around great leaders, and you want to work with great people, and it's who you work with and who you work for. And then the last piece of it is, it kind of allow you to reflect on, man, what do you stand for? What are you about in this journey of life? And, when it's all over, the wins and losses are all great, but it's the amazing people and the amazing impact you can have on others. And so, probably a much needed time of halt and understand that value, Coach, you talked about, especially of what's going on at home.
Well, oftentimes you get, I guess, people say, hey, they get warned, if you will, don't get so busy that you don't have time to think. And COVID kind of did that. I know I was a college president at the time, used to being out 5 or 6 nights a week, chasing, fundraising and going to university events, and all of a sudden you weren't going anywhere. And it gave you a chance to really think through how you were building your team. Ours happened to be a university team. It's a great reminder that taking time to think, we get so excited about being good.
Yep.
And less excited sometimes about thinking about what it takes to be good, or to do whatever it is we can do. And so let me fast forward you backwards to Perry High School when you played. example of a great teammate there, and why? Why was that person a great teammate?
Oh, yeah, such a great question. I would say for me, there were so many of them. But as a sophomore in Perry, I saw maybe one of the most impressive leaders that I've ever witnessed. There was a young man at Perry who was a captain. His name was Ben James, and he was by far our best player. He played in the wing tee, played fullback and linebacker. But one of the great things that I vividly remember on leadership and impact was just his ability to relate with all the young guys in the football program. And as great of a player he was never too big for the moment. And, that Perry team, I want to say we were 6-4, 7-3, but we won a Federal League championship, and probably maybe not the most talented team, but it was one of the most connected teams that I think I was ever a part of as a sophomore in high school. And I always go back to his selfless leadership, his ability to relate to everybody, not just the seniors, not just the juniors, not just the good players, but I felt like everybody played their role really well, and they did because we had player-driven leadership. We had the best player connecting with everybody, and it was something that I took at a really young age and felt like, man, someday if I ever get the opportunity to be that guy, I hope I can be the same type of leader as a player that he was.
We used to always talk about the fact that we are really fortunate as a staff and as a team and as a company or whatever, if the person with the highest perceived role, the best player or the best producer in a business or whatever, if that person is the best person and can relate to everyone else, we're going to have a good team or a good company. It's when that producer or that star or that whatever is kind of out there on the outside and thinks the world revolves around them. I think back to Ohio State when we had Will Smith, great defensive lineman. Every day I'd walk in that locker room after practice, he'd be sitting with a different walk-on player. Now, he's an All-American. He's going to be a first-round draft choice. He had that ability to connect, and it sounds like Ben James. So in your years at Mount Union, how many national championships or national championship games were you in?
Well, as a player, we lost one game in 4 years.
Wow.
And so we won 3 national championships, and still remember the one loss as a freshman in overtime, and which was a tough loss versus Rowan, but yes, so part of 3 national championship teams.
Wow. So as you think back, obviously you played 60 games almost probably with, you start thinking about 14 or 15 games a season. If you think back to someone that really was a great teammate and why on one of those great teams.
Yeah, I think I may go when I think about that team, and it may go to actually one of the coaches. At that time, Don Montgomery ran the defense and, had been a long-time sidekick of Coach Karras. Those two were together for such a long time, and actually Don is back at Mount Union, finishing up and coaching there. And I remember the connection that he built. Mountain had – Coach Karras did such a great job with the offense and was such a, just bigger than life personality that just, his wisdom and his football intelligence were so great. But I felt like Don had gave the heart, the care, the servant leadership, to the program. And I feel like he was able to connect with so many different players that I think when you almost never wanted to let him down, and you obviously never wanted to let Coach Karras down. But I felt like those two had such an incredible partnership. But I felt like Don gave such a great heart to the Mount Union football program that, I feel like he was such an unbelievable connector to the players, the staff, the tradition of Mount Union, that you felt like you never wanted to be the person that let the rope down there at Mount Union during the time of, tradition and execution. But, you really felt like he was such a provider of great leadership to the program.
Did you have Coach Montgomery all 4 years?
I did, yeah. All 4 years.
Because then he went and was the head coach of Emory and Henry?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, at Emory and Henry.
Yep. So what made you decide that, I want to go into coaching and I want to go and try to build teams rather than be a great teammate and be on great teams? I mean, think about it. You lost one game in 4 years. I mean, that's incredible. So What made you think I want to go try to do this in a different role?
Yeah, I really go back to, again, probably my experience in high school and what Coach Wakefield taught me at a critical time. And again, I think are some of our lowest moments. And you went through a transformational time with the value of family, kind of going through a tough divorce, and you had
Mm-hmm.
somebody really stand up like Coach Wakefield, who had such a profound impact. And then you got that opportunity again at Mount Union, and all the wins were great. And we had great success at Perry. We had great success at Mount Union. But it was who I became through the journey that I was always so grateful for. And I was so grateful for the relationship and impact of who I became as a human being, as a person, that I felt like it was critical that I would love to give that back. And honestly, my goal was never to be a Division I head football coach, or maybe even head coach. I think what I wanted to be like was Keith Wakefield. I wanted
Yeah.
to be at a place where kids could come and feel confident, hold them accountable, and hold a standard. But man, when life threw challenges at them, man, can you be there to be able to guide these young people through tough and trying times to help them reach their full potential? And I look back and really grateful to have Keith Wakefield, Larry Karras, Don Montgomery, great humans that were there at such a critical time in life. And I think we all know 18 to 22, 16 to 22, we're going to go through great changes in our lives. And, you need great mentors. So I think that was the real ticket for me of why I knew I wanted to get into coaching.
Hey teammates, I want to tell you about a project we're working on with Youngstown State University. One of the ways Ellen and I have decided to give back is through the Trestle Institute for Leadership and Teamwork. We've collected a set of successful business and nonprofit leaders to serve as guest servant leaders in partnership with the Sokolov Honors College to teach university students teamwork, leadership, and personal skills. We teach from a foundation built on gratitude, excellence, hope, love, and selflessness. If you're a young person or parent helping to search for a unique college experience, you can learn more at trestleinstitute.ysu.edu or ysu.edu. Links will be provided in the show notes. So you went to graduate school
I
at
did.
Bowling Green. What were you going to study at graduate school?
Yeah.
Was it
So
education or was it what?
yeah, educational leadership,
Mm-hmm.
and
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be, at that time, thinking about being an athletic director, or being at some point maybe being like my father, a principal or assistant
Mm-hmm.
principal. And so I really enjoyed my classes at Bowling Green. It was a great time there, and almost getting two great pieces of educational leadership on one side, and then the evolution of the spread offense on the other side of it. Coach Meyer was just leaving there, and the spread offense was like evolving there at Bowling Green at the time,
Mm-hmm.
and some of the who's who of offensive coaches. So you were getting almost a master's class of both areas.
So was Greg Brandon the head coach, or who was
He was coach. He had just taken over as the head
when
football
Urban
coach.
went to Utah?
Yep.
He came, and so as you think about that staff when you were, when you're a grad assistant, you're sitting in the back row, you're not at the head table, that whole thing, and so as you sat back there on the back row and you looked at that staff, you were with 2 years or just one?
2 years.
2 years, yeah. Who really taught you some lessons about team building during that 2 year stint as a GA at Bowling Green?
Yeah, and you talk about 2 incredible years. We had won 10 games and 11 games. My 2 years there, and you know, Coach Meyer had taken almost a down Bowling Green program and had really risen it. But I thought Coach Brandon's 2 years, they really took it to a special level. And
Mm-hmm.
it was a little bit of the who's who of coaches. We had Greg Straw on offense,
Mm-hmm.
Zach Azani, who ended up is the receivers coach now for the Pittsburgh Steelers, and Mick McCall, who was a longtime offensive coordinator, on offense with Northwestern, and then on defense, Tim Beckman, who I know eventually came work for you, and I ended up working later on for at the University of Toledo, and just some Steve Wilkes, was the secondary coach, and so for me, you got to see some of this amazing leadership, and I would say probably, Greg Studraw was a tremendous offensive line coach who ended up coaching for the Buckeyes a little bit and left, Bowling Green to go be the O-line coach and offensive coordinator at LSU, and that's who I was with on the offensive line, which was probably one of the great gifts in coaching because how that offensive line plays usually can have a profound impact on the team. And it he taught me so much about unifying a group and
Mm-hmm.
selflessness. And Greg had played at Bowling Green, and so it was a really prideful to him to watch this program really begin to take off. And it was really fun to watch him unify the offensive side of the football. He was the offensive coordinator as well, and see it from his perspective. And then you flip over on the defensive side, and I'll never forget Steve Wilkes and just the
Mm-hmm.
connection that he was making, in the secondary, and watching how he coached and served the young men, and watch how those guys, man, they were living in his office, and they were always around. They were always, up and in his office, and how he was able to connect with his players. So,
I think the key question is, how did he connect? For our viewers and listeners, say, okay, Coach Campbell says Steve Wilkes really connected. What was it that you think attracted those players to him?
Well, I think he so deeply got involved in their lives, and not just as a football player, but who they were as people. And from having those players at his house, to the ability to know what was going on daily with their lives, it was so impressive to me. And I think between Steve and Greg Studrawa, they were just unbelievable servants of the human, the person. It was
Mm-hmm.
so much bigger than the football player. And I think this just unique ability to connect with the players, to get the players, to have great trust in who they are. And a word that we use a lot in our program now today is trust. And to me, trust starts at the top. It's player to player, player to coach, coach to player. But man, their ability to create trust and create real relationship that far exceeded anything to do with football, but who they were in their development as 18 to 22-year-old young men.
Well, this would be probably our 40th or so episode that when it runs, and the one thread that runs through every one of the team builders we've had on, whether it's a business person, a military person, a healthcare person, a coaching person, you name it, is that genuine care for the person you're building the team with, and them feeling it. And it's genuine. It's important to them. And regardless of what the entity is, I think that there isn't anything more important. And as I hear you talk about Studrawa, and I hear you talk about Wilkes, and then you're talking about Coach Montgomery and Coach Karras and Coach Wakefield, you knew those guys cared about you. And that's what we have to do if we want to build a team.
Well, Coach, it goes back to, I think, your dad's saying of people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And, the reality of it is, everybody that we're in the business of, everybody wants to play on the field. And there's 11 guys on the field, on offense, defense, and special teams. But the reality of it is, we're still dealing with young people at such a critical time in their lives, 18 to 22 years old. And the thing that I've always appreciated, and even remembering that as a player and a young coach, is everybody knows if it's authentic. Everybody knows
Mm-hmm.
if that's real.
Yeah.
Do you really care for who I am and what I'm going through?
Yeah.
Or is that just a show? And I think it was so great as a young coach and as a player to see people that were deeply, authentically knew that these people were invested in who you were as a person and who you were becoming as a young man.
Well, and what a critical point to bring out. I don't care if you're a coach somewhere or you're working with employees somewhere. Young people or people you're supervising know if you're genuine. They have a sixth sense, and you can't fool them. And you need to be genuine, and every second of the day, not just, oh, I think I'll be genuine today. Every second of the day that you're a part of them.
Yeah, no, we say this all the time. Everybody asks me about Brock Purdy. What made Brock Purdy such a special player? And I said, geez, he had this unbelievable ability to know who he was. He was never trying to be somebody else. He had the ability to consistently show up and be the same person every day. And even in our world today, evaluating great coaches, the great coaches that we have on our staff, they've got that same value system, and it starts with this genuine servant leadership and care factor for humanity and for the lives of others.
So you became a head coach, and just like when any of us became a head coach, we probably thought we knew more than we did, but then all of a sudden you sit in that seat, and it's like, whoa. What's one thing that you could share with our viewers and listeners about a lesson you learned going from a assistant coach who needed to do something very important for the whole to a head coach who was concerned about every single thing?
Yeah, well, it was fascinating, in taking over. I always tell this story, because there was really no thought of me becoming the head coach, to be honest with you. At 31, I'm the offensive coordinator, and on a Wednesday, Tim Beckman, leaves and gets the Illinois job, and we were at the end of the football season, and he had certainly earned it, had done a great job, and you know, you fast forward to 5 days later, and the athletic director calls and says, "Would you be interested in being the head coach?" And so there wasn't a whole lot of time to think about it, and I always said it was a really unfair situation because Toledo was getting ready to play a bowl game, and our first game was in 3 weeks in the Military Bowl versus Air Force. So I thought it was the biggest setup of all time.
Right.
Not only do you have to be the head coach, but you got to be the head coach, and you got to go play Air Force in the Military Bowl, and try to figure out how to defend the option. But I think it quickly dawned on me as we were getting ready for our first practice was, you're not the offensive coordinator anymore, and you're in charge of this entirety of this football team and this football program. And, I think two things that I learned really fast because, probably the advantage that I had taking over from that perspective was you knew what had went well, and maybe you knew a little bit of maybe what some of the challenges were. But I remember I met with every existing staff member and player, and I wanted to get their feedback. And I asked this question: what are we doing well here from your perspective? What are we not doing well? And if you were the head coach, what change would you make? And I didn't want to take it for granted that I'm 31. I didn't want to take it for granted that I knew all the answers. And I wanted to get perspective from the people on the team to maybe have some guidance of, yes, we've done some good things, but man, there's still a lot of good things out there left for us to do. Maybe they could guide me on exactly what are the right moves moving forward. And I really felt like they gave me a great roadmap to be able to make some of the right choices to get off to a good start rather than just assuming that I had all the answers going into it.
One of the things that you and I have talked about for years is the more we know how our guys are thinking and what's going on inside their heads, because there's so much information being pumped to them, social media and experts, and there's football on all night long, and they can watch a game and say, oh, we ought to be doing that, and whatever. And it's so important, those questions you asked as you took over, that, hey, what are we doing well? What can we do better? And I would add one thing on the what have we been doing well? I would add a sub-question, and you may have, and how did we get to doing that well? Because it didn't just happen. And I think sometimes we take for granted when we do something well, and we don't really think back to how we got good at it. And to me that's an additional thing that I want to know, that how we got good at those things.
No, I think that's a great point. And, I think as you and I have even talked after our own season this year, that how did we do some of the things that allowed us to have success, and defining that accurately is a great opportunity to sustaining success moving forward. But no, that value of asking those questions, I really felt like, especially at Toledo, it gave us a real chance to kind of help guide. How do we build this program the right way moving forward? And really grateful that I was able to get some of that great feedback.
Well, I always felt that the University of Toledo in the Mid-American Conference was one of the really good places. Great location, a lot of good football players close by, great university, good majors that, you have engineering, you have some things that, good tough kids like to take, and they like hard things. And I always thought it was a good one. I didn't know much about Iowa State other than I worked for Earl Bruce, and every day in our staff meetings at Ohio State, Earl Bruce would tell us that we weren't as tough as Iowa State. We weren't as tough as the Iowa State coaches or the Iowa State players. Outside of that, I didn't know much about Iowa State. I had the good fortune to come out and visit you this year and just see what you have there. And when I say what, I don't mean just the beautiful stadium and the great facilities and the gorgeous campus and so forth, but what you have there is a group of people who are really trying to figure out how they can be the best collective group. And that's not always the case. Go around and visit a lot of places, and there's a lot of situations where people are worried about, what do I got to do to get the NFL, or what do I have to do to do this and that. And I know it's been, 9 years now there?
Yeah. Yep.
What do you think, if you had to pick 3 keys to growing to become that team atmosphere place that's so obvious to me that you have created, give our listeners 3 things that you think have been paramount.
Yeah, I would say number one is recruiting the right people. I feel whether that has been our coaching staff or the players, identifying values to recruit the right people. And for us, those values really haven't wavered. It's number one, recruit great character people. Iowa State, from a location, one of the great things about our program is there's no pro sports in this state, and there are 2 major Division I universities, but no pro sports. So, there is a great fan base. There is great.
Mm-hmm.
I always say we're the Green Bay Packers of college football a little bit. It's college town USA,
Yeah.
but there's a great responsibility to be a student athlete here, especially as our program has grown forward. That we were willing to not shortcut talent with character. And, I think we've been able to do a great job collectively holding ourselves, accountable to that standard. And then I would say this equally, same thing with our coaching staff. I'd rather hire a coaching staff that I can lose with first before hire a coaching staff that I can win with. I don't want to know how great your X's and O's are. I would like to know who you are as a human and what you stand for as a man and what you stand for in leading people. And so I'd say character goes into that value. Number 2 is passion for the sport. Do you love it? Trying to get a mile deep in a young person's passion for the sport of football. And then equally the same thing, the curiosity and excitement and passion that a coach has for the opportunity to grow 18 to 22-year-old young men. And then the last piece of it, I really felt is like understanding the value of education. And so, that opportunity to recruit based on that model has been really big for us and not wavering from that. I think number 2 has been retention, creating a culture where both coaches and players feel like that they can come and really grow, and not just grow as football players, but grow as young men, and our coaches grow and be able to, if they came in here as a graduate assistant, maybe someday they've got the ability to come back here and be the quarterback coach, or if they're the quarterback coach, maybe become the offensive coordinator. And, we've been really fortunate, both from a retention rate of our student athlete here. I think we've been in the top 5 in the country in the last 5 years, a retention rate of our players, with staying within our football program, not losing them to the transfer portal. And that's been really big for us because we'll always be better here when we're an older football team than a younger football team. And then the other value for us is our coaching staff and the continuity that we've been able to have. And Coach, one of your former great coaches, Coach Haycock on defense, has been the staple to our success here defensively, and so many great coaches under him. And then the same thing on the offensive side of the ball. We've been able to keep so many great coaches who some have gone on and risen up the ranks and are in the National Football League now. And, a lot of our coaches on the offensive side of the football are young men that have been with our football program up to 9, 10, 11, 12 years. So I think that's been really good in retention. And then the last piece of it is development, is the ability to be great developers. And I think that responsibility starts with me as the head football coach, is, building a program for our student athletes, our players, and development is identifying, not just the physical development, but the mental, spiritual, and the opportunity to, academically develop our student athletes. And then equally for our coaches, how do I help develop them? How do I make them the best teachers and give them the best tools in their toolbox to serve our players? And so those three values we really haven't wavered off of in 9 years is recruit, retain, develop, and pound away at those three value systems, and feel like it's my responsibility to make the decisions in this program that are around those three values.
It's been fun to watch what you guys have done there. No one in Iowa State history has done what your staff has done, especially for that length of time. I know some people have come in maybe quick and spent a couple years and had a good year and gone or whatever. And it's really, I guess, reassuring to me that those things that are team building things, can still result in special. You guys won 11 games this year. I don't think Iowa State had won 11 games ever, was it? Or
ever? Yeah,
ever. Yeah.
Yeah.
And just the things that you've done. And I had a chance to be out there when you went out and made a difference with that community group where you brought the underprivileged kids in, and every one of your kids, teamed up with them, and just to see the way that community, the pride in it, and so forth. To me, it's been a great study. I've learned so much from being around you guys, and it's been an honor to be that. I'm going to give you the hardest question last. Okay?
I'm ready.
What do you think college football is going to look like in 5 years? Or how about this? What do you hope college football looks like?
Well, I think what you said, Coach, is you said a little bit earlier, is can we get the right people in the room to figure out how we don't lose the integrity of college athletics, especially college football, and the understanding that we get it. There's a financial gain. There's a lot of interest. There's more interest today than there ever has been. But at the root of that interest is still 18 to 22-year-old young men. There's 18-year-old young men that it's still our responsibility to grow into 22-year-old men and be great fathers, be great husbands. Football will end someday, and these young men being able to go lead their own families and own communities, it's still our responsibility. So I think at some point we hope the right people get into the room to find the ability to, yes, there's a financial gain to be made, and those things are great. And I think we all would all agree that, serving financially the student athlete experience, there should be some value to that. But we can't lose the value of education, the value of team, the value of working through hard and adversity, because I think what we'll lose is one of the great opportunities to grow and instill leadership in young people today. So 5 years from now, you hope that the right people get in the room and we find a way to bring equity, fix, some of the challenges that are out there, and the ability to carry on the value system that still resides in college athletics and certainly in college football.
We used to always say that our hopes for our players is that we were preparing them for the rest of their lives, which all of it wasn't going to be perfect. They may go to the NFL, they may not. They may have good health, they may not. They may have a family, they may not. They may have business interests that go well, they may not. But we were going to prepare them to be able to handle the rest of their life. I guess the only concern for me with the current setup is, have we created enough hardship and struggle so that they'll be strong enough to handle the inevitable hardship and struggle later on? And not that I mean that we shouldn't have been treating them better because of the help and the revenue they've been generating. We should have figured something out 40 years ago. But that's my biggest concern, is I just hope that we haven't acquiesced to, well, they were treated unfairly for all those years, and now we're going to maybe overcompensate, if you will. But we'll have to stay tuned in. How many conferences do you think there'll be 5 years from now?
Oh gosh, Coach, you probably have a better worldly vision on that. I think you hope that the clarity of, you know, regional success, I think, having the ability to, we're so spread out right now, and I get it,
Yep.
and I certainly understand it, but, the impact that can have on really all of our student athletes. Again, when you still put student in front of this experience, I think we've probably got to look at that and understand the value of what that impact can have on our players, on our 18 to 22 year olds. But it's certainly an interesting time for sure on that. I know it certainly seems like we're creeping to two major conferences, but is that right? Will that keep the interest of those fan bases? Jack Trice Stadium here in Little Old Ames, Iowa, still sold out every Saturday, and
Yep.
people really care and believe that their Cyclones can play no matter who steps on the field, that they got a chance to win. So, I think that's still one of the great joys for myself, and I know our staff, is even though it's become transactional in a lot of places, we've been really fortunate to be able to still prove that we can step on the field for 60 minutes and we can play great team football and just maybe give ourselves chances to win football games on Saturday
Against anybody.
against anybody.
And that's pretty cool. I think if it goes to the two main conferences, you'll end up with four conferences, really. You'll have two divisions of two conferences. And I remember saying back in the 90s to someone, what they ought to do is those big boys ought to go and take those top 72 or 80 teams, and because it's a different world. Because we weren't generating money at Mount Union, Baldwin-Wallace, Youngstown State, but of course they were at Ohio State and Iowa State and those big guys, and so it'll be interesting. Last one on that topic. How many teams do you think will be in the playoffs in 5 years?
Well, I think even just our own experience, coach in Division III football, and I'm sure when your dad was the coach at Baldwin Wallace to my experience in time when there was 32 playing at Mount Union, the growth of the playoff system and getting, just like we saw this year, I mean, getting an actual winner probably makes a lot of sense. Now, hopefully, we can trim this down to understand, how we get to the right number of regular season games and the right number of playoff games, because you certainly feel for those Ohio State student athletes and those Notre Dame student athletes that didn't really get a break, and next thing you know, they played in the national championship game and they're both back at school, and I think that's really hard. But I still think the value of a playoff system is highly valued, and I think you saw even this year of playing some of these games on college campuses and the excitement around the playoff system. I will only see that number growing. You can imagine in 5 years from now, are we at 16? Or are we? Do we get to that point? Do we get to a larger number? But I certainly think the opportunity to expand the playoff system makes a lot of sense for college athletics, and I think gives teams even hope late into the season in their fan bases that they're playing for something bigger than just a conference championship, which I think is pretty neat.
I don't have a vote, but if I had a vote, I'd go 16 teams and 10 regular season.
Agree.
Because I'm just a little worried about the wear and tear we're taking on the players. And if it happens multiple years, I just remember, well, you played 4 straight years of multiple games. But, you guys probably weren't going to the NFL other than Pierre Garçon or somebody that was on those teams. But so that was just one more game they get to play the rest of their life.
Right.
You look at the guys at Iowa State or Ohio State or Tennessee or Notre Dame, and if for 3 straight years you played 4 extra games, that's probably a year shorter of a future.
That's right.
You'd have, and so I would go to 10 regular season and 16. And have it regional. You kind of brought that up, regionally interested,
That's right.
because that's where the rivalries are. And right now here in Ohio, we've got Oregon and USC and Washington, and those are great schools. Yep. But I don't see the excitement of that being a rivalry. But you and I won't have a vote. We'll get a chance to go, and so. I'm going to hear it. This truly is my last question because I've gone over time. I know how busy you are. Tell me the best thing that Coach John Haycock does to help promote great team at Iowa State? Because I know he did it for us at Youngstown State.
Well, the best thing that we've been able to have is I've given our senior class development to Coach Haycock, and really pouring into leading our seniors. And you said it earlier a little bit about when our best players are our best leaders, we've always had the best opportunity to be successful. Well, I've also felt like when our senior classes have had their best years and have played their best football at the end, then we've also had the ability to have a great team. And Coach Haycock's wisdom and being a tremendous head coach, and obviously being under your tutelage, Coach, he brings so much wisdom to all of us. And so the ability to impact our seniors, kind of create a blueprint for our senior class to kind of hang their hat on, and develop that through his classes through the spring semester and through the summer. It's been awesome, and the impact that he's not only had on me as a coach and our assistant coaches here, but certainly our players. It's been bigger than just calling defense. It's certainly been the impact that he's had on them and their leadership, but he's done a great job with our seniors.
And he certainly is genuine. What you see is what you get, right? And he knows, they know he loves them, and, that's so critical. Well, this has been so much fun to be sitting here for over an hour. I'm afraid I told you I'd only go 45 minutes, but I start talking about the game of football and building up young men and so forth. But it's truly been an honor to sit here with the greatest coach in Iowa State history, and that's a big deal because my mentor, Earl Bruce, was a great coach there. Johnny Majors was a great coach there. Coach McCarney, and you had your share of great ones. But I appreciate you. I always enjoy conversations with you, and I'm always a Cyclone fan.
Coach, I can't thank you enough for all the impact you've had on me and our staff, our program, and honestly, even for me as a young football coach, it's been great to have a great mentor to look up to, and really appreciate everything you stand for.
Yeah, thanks so much. And teammates, that was a pretty good episode right there. Until the next time, it's all about the team.